I'm going to go ahead. No, I don't actually remember who gave the presentation. Something happened and we didn't have it updated. Anyway, as soon as he comes back, I guess we'll go ahead and start. Okay, it looks like it should be streaming. It's capturing audio from a voice, and we've got that up there on the screen. Okay, great. So, well, hello everyone, and welcome to another exciting night of Utah Stack.js. For those of you that were able to make it through the sleet, yeah. Oh, whoops, I'm going to take the little thingamabob down. All right. So, tonight's presentation, I'll be presenting AJ O'Neill. Thank you to Vivint for hosting and providing pizza to Travis for hosting us as well and taking care of that. And yeah, so tonight is going to be You Don't Know ESM, and basically the premise of this is ECMAScript modules have gone through many iterations of partial specification, but they were not implemented in browsers until March of 2023, and they were not implemented in Node until December of 2024. So that would be 2 months ago. So a lot of people think that they've been using ESM, but they haven't. What they've been using is essentially pseudo modules that are in a bespoke language for that transpiler or whatever. And so that's why we're going to talk about the real ESM. Let's see if I can get this to go. Oh no, I don't want that. Why is that coming up? That shouldn't be on that screen. Okay, there we go. All right, so ESM, JavaScript modules, that's what it is. So to cut to the chase, there are basically three syntaxes for modules that work. Well, there's a few more than that technically work, but that are reasonable to use. And then you have three different import configs that you have to define depending on what environment you're working in and what tools you are working with. So first, let's just talk about if you want to create or export a module, what that looks like. So we're talking at this point, we're just talking about a file. So let's go from the top. We have a default export. So we have, instead of let foo equals module.exports, you have let foo equals an empty object. Then you can fill out that object. So here foo.noop equals a noop function. And then export default foo. So export default, those are the keywords. And then foo. And that is how, that is a, these are all, that's foo.js essentially. So if you then want to import that, the way you import it is import foo from, it's a string and it cannot be an interpreted string. So this is one of the things that's weird. The import functionality comes from a Ruby guy who was a hardcore Ruby guy and wasn't really a fan of JavaScript, and that's why it's breaking syntax rather than using syntax that we already have. It's breaking syntax, and then the syntax that's there that you're familiar with doesn't work the way that you think it would because that string is not an expression. It's a different type of string. So that's important to know. You cannot use a template string there. You cannot have an expression like this plus that or whatever. It is a string. It is a static string, and that's all that it is. And then the semicolon. And it's important to note that this is a file name. So you will see, and it is only a JavaScript file. You do not import CSS, you do not import HTML, and you do not import TypeScript or other stuff. Imports work only with JavaScript and only with files. They don't work with directories. So if you want to reference this, you can't do /foo. That doesn't work. It needs to be /foo.js. Now, of course, if you're using a transpiler, the transpilers, while they've gone through the various iterations, because the basic syntax of import name from string, that was defined over a decade ago. But what it meant and how it would work was not defined until later. So by the time that they defined how file paths would work. You already had these transpilers that worked with other types of paths and stuff. Anyway, so that's it. So
strictly speaking, there doesn't need to be a file name. Strictly speaking, it's just the path name in an HTTP request for requesting the JavaScript file, which the server could map onto it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair. Yes. If we're talking, when we're talking about HTTP, I mean, but it's still a file. Yes. But it could be dynamically generated. But yes. But it needs. The point is that it's not guessing an extension. Yeah. It has to be something that's going to be MIME type JavaScript. Yeah. And
unless your server guesses the extension for
you. But that's not part of the import syntax. That's part of. Then you're talking about other magic. So okay, there's transpiler magic and there's server magic, but import doesn't do that. All right, so then you have the default require. Now this gets weird because of course the way that things ended up working out, they made the two syntaxes kind of incompatible. So when you do a default require, when you've done an export default, you would expect, because it's the default thing, it'd be what you get when you require it. It's what you get when you import it. But it's not what you get when you require it. When you require it, what you get is the meta information of the module. And so then whatever is exported as default comes out as .default, as a property on it. So if you wanted, so when you require the module, what you actually get is the module metadata. And then to get the module as exported, then you need to access it as .default. So that's a bit there.
One quick little just side thought, like they introduced, they being ambiguous, MJS extensions to denote it is a module for exports. So some of the transpilers, like you don't have to do as much configuring if you use the MJS extension, but that's probably a moot point now that it's native, but certain versions of older versions of Node you probably may want.
But you're going to get bespoke behavior. It's not spec behavior. The import spec doesn't know about MJS or CJS. It's just looking at JavaScript files. Anyway, so then sorry, I called that default export at the top. I'll fix that. That's the full export. Or individual exports. So you can also do, and this is really weird because you export an expression, which is strange to me. So you can't, so I do let foo equals empty object. I do foo.noop is, the thing. And I would expect that, okay, I'm going to export foo.create, I guess, or something like that. But you don't. Or export foo, But no, what you do is you export let blah 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 equals, or you export, you could do, well, constant doesn't make sense because it's a variable, not a constant, but anyway, but you export an expression, and so it takes this type of syntax. So we would, and this was supposed to say no-op. I copy pasted something wrong there because anyway, so that should say no-op. Don't get rid of that. I probably had the same mistake on the previous slides, but yeah, so this would be no-op if you want to keep the naming the same. And then for the import, this is, it gets a little bit ugly because you think, okay, well, if I don't have a default export, then it should just take all the things that are exported individually and make that the default. No, that's not the case. It still has a default export. The default export will just be, I think, an empty object. I don't remember, but it's not useful, so we don't really have to get into the specifics of it.
It's flat out undefined.
Okay. And then import, so you do import star as foo from foo, and then that right there will basically glob all of the exports back into the original object. So why would you want to do that? Well, you might want to do that if you want your require to work. So if you don't want to export at this point, there's no sense in not exporting the default though. But the reason that you need to do it this way is so that it doesn't break NPM packages. Because up until December of 2024, if you were to publish an ESM module, then it would break NPM packages. And then if somebody were to require it, things would go haywire. This is how you seamlessly upgrade a module that you have that, say for some reason you actually need to update your module. Obviously, don't update modules senselessly because you're just introducing, potential breaking things. I mean, anybody who's not updated on node 22.13 or no 12, whatever it was. Anybody who's not up to that version, it's just going to break their stuff if you republish an old module. But to maintain compatibility with NPM, when you export your modules this way, then when somebody NPM installs them without any transpiling, without any server magic, transpiler magic, installer magic, it's just going to work where they can then require it, and it'll work exactly the way that it has worked up to this point.
And again, just some other side thoughts on this. I would never do the personally, I like to do the curly brace syntax of importing the pieces that I want to use out of that module.
And we're going to go over exactly why you shouldn't do that momentarily. All right, so the rumors are not true. So there's a lot of FUD that's been passed around over the years that is just completely baseless, or I shouldn't say baseless. It may have been based on some comment from someone talking about how something was more difficult or something could be more easy in the future, but none of it ended up being real. So async module loading is real, right? Like you do get async module loading with import, but it's kind of more of a downside than an upside because all it means is that the modules take longer to load, which is why a lot of people are using transpilers to bundle them back together. So it's, if you're in the category of I put one function per file and I have 52 files in a module, well, the async module loading isn't going to give you anything. It's not going to help you. It's going to hurt you. Likewise, you're not getting async module loading like what you get with Quick, where the modules are loaded on demand as needed. It's still going and reading all the files and loading all the modules. It's not running your code without and waiting for the optimal time to lazy load or something like that. But it is async, and that was one of the reasons that for a long time they just let NPM be broken, because the spec actually only needs the module execution to be async if it has an await at the top level, because we have top level await in ESM. Don't ever use top level await for anything that you're publishing publicly. It makes a lot of sense for your server.js or your app.js to have a top level await, but it does not make any sense for library code to have a top level await. Again, all you would do is you'd end up breaking stuff that you're publishing downstream. So that's important. The tree shaking stuff, I mean, logically you can just think about this. Whether or not you decompose something syntactically has no bearing on how a compiler is going to be able to optimize it or interpret it. So tree shaking is going to happen if it's implemented correctly, and it's not going to happen if it's not implemented correctly. You're not going to get better tree shaking from using one syntax versus another syntax, because the thing that's doing the tree shaking has to analyze the code, and both internally and externally it has to figure out where things are being used. The one thing that you would shoot yourself in the foot on is if you're dynamically accessing properties. So if you're using a variable to access, so instead of calling foo.noop, if you were using a variable called named noop and then indexing into foo, then there is a chance that the tree shaking might not work. But even in that case that I mentioned, of course it would work, because it would statically analyze that the name is the string foo, and then when it parses, or is the name noop, and then when it parses the foo, then it would be able to detect that that's the property that's being used. So basically anything that has fully static analysis is going to be able to do tree shaking, and it's going to be a fault in your logic, not a fault in your syntax, that makes tree shaking work or not work. And then all the conference slides. I mean, there's just so many things people have talked about over the years. There is nothing that can or can't be done with the import syntax that can or can't be done with other with the require syntax or with ifs or whatever. Other than that, it's forced asynchronous loading between files. Other than that, it's all the same. You're not getting any optimizations. You're not getting any detriments. The trade-offs are all the same. If you bundle code, then whether or not you use import doesn't matter because you're using a transpiler. If you're not bundling code, if you have thousands of small one-line functions, obviously it's going to be slow. If you are judicious in keeping 10 or 12 files and they're well organized and they're chunked out well by their utility, then you're going to get all the benefits of caching that the browser has to offer. So it's no magic pill, obviously. Well, not obviously, because it's often preached as a magic pill. But there's no magic pill here. It's just a syntax. But now that everything supports it, as of December 2024, I highly recommend using it. Okay, so there is this. So first of all, the simpler tools that we can use, the better. So one of the nice things about import is that some of the tools are better optimized for handling types that are passed through via the imports. That the syntax is slightly different, and the TypeScript checker, which is the most common tool for checking types in JavaScript, it's more optimized for the import syntax. It's not that it couldn't do just the same with require, but there's some issues where it can get confused, and import is just a more streamlined experience. But just because we have complex tools doesn't mean that you should have to use them. You should be able to, in a code base, just grep for a string and go find the thing and be able to quickly find references to what you're looking for. So if you are doing the destructuring, which became popular, I think it became popular because somebody at a conference said that if you destructure, then you're going to get tree shaking. Obviously, that was not true, because in order for tree shaking to happen, the thing that's doing the transpiling has to implement it. And at the time that conference talk was popular, nobody had actually implemented tree shaking yet. So it was completely a moot point. But this became popular. But look at what this does to your code. You start stuttering everything, right? So you have a create stutter, a get stutter, a set stutter, and then when you go to look through your package for where things are, it's not easy to figure out, okay, there are 27 instances where I'm calling methods from the stutter package. But it would be very, very, very easy to find, okay, there's 27 instances where I'm calling methods from the foo package. So if you namespace your packages properly, you're going to be able to use simpler tools, and you're going to be able to do more. Like when you need to refactor or when there's a breaking change to something, you're just going to have a better time. This is just, I don't understand it, other than I know that there was a conference talk where somebody made the false claim that you were going to get these optimizations from tree shaking, which had not been implemented yet in the first place. But yeah, that's not true. So you go ahead. You tell me. Do you think that there is a benefit to doing it this way? Because I do not.
Not that I can think of now that you've gone over that. Yeah, I like that stance. I do like destructuring things, but I guess importing the top level module, I can still destructure pieces of it after the fact. But,
Yeah,
a while back I tested this with ESBuild and confirmed that it does treat both syntaxes the same in terms of tree shaking.
Yeah.
Exactly as AJ said.
Yeah, and I don't doubt that there was a brief period where one of the build tools had on their roadmap to implement the tree shaking for one syntax before the other syntax, but that would have been a matter of hours or days, not like obviously not a limitation of the program. Okay, so like I was mentioning before, if we want things to be both compatible, maximally compatible with the browser and with NPM, then what you would want to do, again, this typo persisted, that should be foo.noop, I'll fix that. But the way to do this is to simply export everything that you want to be public and then export default your module. And then when you do it that way, this syntax is what's going to allow it to not break anything on NPM. And this syntax is what's going to allow it to look fluid and nice in the browser import. All right. So up to this point, you may have noticed that all we talked about was files, and they were files that ended in .js. That's all about my local experience of how am I managing my relative imports. But as you may have noticed, relative imports kind of suck because we've all had, at least in the Node world, even in React, whatever you're doing, we've all had that problem with a .. right? Your application grows and suddenly you need to reference something that's up a level and over a sibling module that logically it makes perfect sense to separate it out into another folder, but then you get all this .. business. And then obviously when we don't want to have to do / node modules / foo / index.js. So this part is, one part is how are we defining the exports and importing them. The other part is how do we give them aliases so that it's ergonomic to work with them. And there are 3 different syntaxes that are different, and the subtle differences are important because if you get it wrong, then either your linter won't work, or your type checker won't work, or it won't load in the browser, or it won't load in Node. So it's kind of a pain in the butt, but the configs that I'm about to show you are taken from real working projects, so the nuance that's there should be demonstrated accurately. Well, of course, I renamed the things to foo, but here we go. So in an index.html, you have a script type import map, which is JSON. It syntactically must be JSON, and there's not too many tools yet that are validating this. The HTML tidy tools won't know what to do with this. They'll just ignore it for the most part. They just, like I said, it only came out in March of 2023 that browsers had implemented it across the board. So I can understand where a lot of tooling, they don't want to support something that's not well implemented. Now it is well implemented. Hopefully the tooling will catch up soon. But the import map needs to happen before you do any script type equals module. And the import map is what allows you to have aliases to a file path. So you can think of this as templating, copy, paste, placeholder type of stuff. So, and you'll notice that the strings are an exact match. So foo has to be defined and foo / also has to be defined. And the way that this works out is that when you do the import, it simply does a find and replace of the string foo and then replaces it with /foo.js. And then same thing here. When it finds the string foo / it replaces it with ./lib/. So then if you wanted to import foo / baz.js, that would become ./lib/baz.js. So you're kind of familiar with the way this works in NPM, and in the various transpilers provide this behavior. But this is a critical piece that needed to be standardized for us to not have to, it'd just be so tedious to do / node modules, blah, blah, blah. And then also to have to do the .. // So this, relative to this index.html, it's going to do that find and replace. So if you're nested 4 levels deep and you require foo, it's not going to do a dumb find and replace of /foo.js. It's going to do an intelligent, okay, let me look at where you are relative to where this was defined, and it's going to do the right thing, which is what you get in with Node already for published modules, but this is not just affecting published modules. Now you can give your own top-level module a namespace in your own code for the browser. And then, so for, just as an example, I put in here a /node modules bar index.js. So if you were to use npm to install packages that you intend to use from HTML, then this is literally what that would look like. It would need to give the full path.
Never thought about putting the modules in a public space, but that's fine.
Well, we used to do it with Bower, or maybe it was called Bower modules for Bower. I mean, there's so many of these things that have happened over the years. I know, like most people are using transpilers, but we can go away from the transpilers now.
Yeah.
So anyway, so here's an example where I have a module, and what I want to do is I want to be able to make this module accessible to my HTML so that I can use it for form handlers. So what I'm doing is I'm saying import foo UI from foo/UI.js, and I often call it something like UI or DOM, so to signify that these functions that I'm going to call here are the functions that are meant to be accessible to the HTML. And I actually normally put a $sign in front of them, but I didn't do that here. Anyway, so then to make it accessible to the HTML, I have to assign it to the window. So foo UI equals foo UI, assign it to window, and now we can see up here on my form, I have method equals dialog to prevent it from doing an actual HTTP request, just as a fallback in case something were to go wrong. And then on submit, I have equals foo UI.submit window.event. And so this foo UI is a module, but even though it's a module, I can still access it from the HTML because I exported it down here. So that's kind of the full loop. This is how I really do it.
Some warning about attaching things to a window. In my testing with ES build, it does not tree shape that way. Because once you attach something to the global object, it kind of loses track of what you're doing with it.
Yep, that would make sense. But since, well, in my case, I literally only, that's purpose-built functions, right? Like the only functions that I'm exporting into the HTML are the functions that I am going to call on event handlers, like on click, on submit, on blur, whatever, that sort of thing. So that is a good note, and I'm glad that you brought that up. And that is one of those instances of you're making it dynamic and you're taking it outside of the scope of the transpiler, because the transpiler can't know what else is going to happen with the window object, and then it becomes dynamic. So that makes sense. So in package.json, you have 3 different things that you need to do. As far as I can tell, the import syntax in package.json is verbatim the same as the import map in the HTML. You do need to specify type equals module, kind of. Now that they've fixed the incompatibility with the spec as of December, I don't know if this is actually necessary anymore, but what it will do is it will change some of the default behavior. So by default, it will try to parse it as a module. And if it fails, I'm not sure if it goes back to parsing it as CommonJS. But if you don't do anything, it'll just read the file now, and then it will parse it and do the right thing. It'll give you a warning if it thought it was supposed to parse it as one way and then it ended up having to parse it a different way. It'll print out a warning that says you did not specify what type of module and this had to be reparsed and it has a performance impact. Obviously the performance impact on that is pretty negligible. But it did have to stop and then restart the parser because the parser failed.
If you don't want that line in your package.json, you can give your node files the .mjs extension and it'll understand that too.
And I don't know if web browsers are updated for that, but yes, you
As
can.
you mentioned earlier, the browsers don't care what your extension is.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean browser. I meant web server. Sorry, web server. I don't know if it's common for web servers to put the type, the MIME type for JavaScript on MJS, like with JS. And you do want your JavaScript files to have the MIME type of JavaScript. But yes, I don't recommend that. Yes, you can do that. One of the great benefits to me about being able to switch over to import is I have less crap to go through to make a perfectly valid JavaScript library work in both the browser and node. So what I was doing before was I had a little shim with the window versus module.exports that's similar to the UMD thing, but a little bit shorter because I don't care about define.js because No one uses, well, I guess it's called require.js, but the function's defined. And nobody's used that for a decade. I mean, that was very, very early days. So we don't need all that extra cruft for something that really, it's like, it would be like me trying to support Bower in my package JSON. It's like, nobody's using Bower anymore. I don't even think the website's up anymore. Maybe it is. But yeah, so you got the imports here. That syntax is the same module thing. Yes, if it's purely a Node package, sure, throw the .mjs on there. But if it's purely a Node package, there's no advantage just putting type module in there either. But I would say if you want to share the code between Node and the browser, just give it the JavaScript extension. And then the exports has a different syntax, and I don't quite know the history of why this is. I believe that it has to do with earlier transpilers before import map syntax was being discussed in committees. My guess, and this is purely a guess, is that this imports part here was probably discussed alongside the browser committees. Like they may have actually began to communicate, and that may be why they happen to be exactly the same, and then these are different. But these also do different functions. So the imports is telling Node what you want your module to be named in the same way that we were telling browser what you want your module to be named. So the imports is telling Node, when you look at this package in of itself, these are the names to use. The exports is actually kind of doing a different thing. The export is saying when you require this through Node modules or you import this through Node modules, what should it look like externally? So imports is kind of saying, how should I look at this internally? And exports is saying, how should this be looked at externally? And ideally, to me, it seems like you'd want the two to be the same, that if somebody imports foo, that the way that you use foo internal to your package would be the same way that they would use foo external to your package. But for whatever reason, it has these two different syntaxes. And this one, the dot just means whatever the name is. So in the package.json, I've omitted 90% of the package. But you have the name of the module. So here, dot will refer to the name of the module. So if the name of the module is foo, then this dot essentially takes the name foo, and then foo.js is what that refers to. So I would recommend keeping that consistent. Your imports that you specify the name there should be the same as the name that you specify up top, and then your exports should follow the same pattern. If you do, and this one this one is one I messed up there too. That would have been lib. So like I said, I copied these from other projects, and then I just quickly renamed everything to foo and bar and lib and stuff like that. So that would have been lib. That was unintentional to be different.
And that dot slash works for the bar somehow, or like would you need to have another export for bar?
Oh, okay. So in this case, bar is not something that would be exported because this is vendored. So this would be something like I'm using it as an internal dependency, but it's not something that I'd be exporting. Yeah. So that's the reason for that. And then we have our jsconfig.json or your tsconfig.json, which is for your TypeScript checker, which again, don't be afraid. We don't do TypeScript around here. We're not that kind of people. By we, I mean I. But the TypeScript checker, it needs this config. And there's some weird stuff about this config. So you'll see target is ES 2022. That's the latest version. And the way that I actually come up with this is there's a command that I run and I just pass it. I just keep passing. I think I just pass it whatever the current date is or the current year is. And then I just subtract 1 or something like that. Because you can't get the list. Yeah, that's what I do. I just take the current year, and then in the error message, like the help doesn't give you the list of what's supported, but the error message will give you the list of what's supported. So in my tooling, I actually will just put ES and then the current year, and then expect it to fail, and then I'll read the failure message and then parse out the largest number in the error message, and then put that into the jsconfig.json as my initializer. Node, the module needs to be Node next, and that might seem kind of weird because like, what does this have to do with ESM? Why are we talking about Node? But it's just dependency not dependency, legacy stuff. It's just that's the way that it was done, and so that's the way that it is done.
Like the strategy that it looks for paths like known modules and
Yeah, because this config. Remember, TypeScript was initially a C# adaptation, and it worked with the global window object. And then, and they were going on a completely different path. They were just doing their browser thing. They're transitioning C# devs to be browser devs. And then Node was, developing along its own path, and it was a different ecosystem. And then they started to say, okay, well, we want to support Node. And then, and then Google got involved, and then the import syntax was actually starting to get adopted. So there's a lot of these names of things that go back, 10 or 15 years or however long it's been, somewhere in that range of 10 to 15 years, I think. And so, yeah, this is just a trust me, bro. Like, you can go read up what the difference between target and module resolution is. And it's a little confusing, but this is what works. And then with paths is similar syntax to exports in package.json. So you can see here, and this time I actually didn't put a typo on. It's like the first slide where that's not typoed. Let's see if I got the other ones right. Okay, I got that one wrong. Yeah, I gotta go fix these typos. Anyway, so foo/star is .lib. ./lib/star foo, that should have been ./foo.js, and then bar would be, and it wasn't a typo that I switched between node modules and vendor. I was just showing an example of, realistically you might npm install something and then want to access it, or you might just curl and download it and put it in your vendor folder or whatever. But anyway, so that's what that looks like. So that's pretty much the same as the exports syntax in the package.json. So if you think of your package.json, imports is the same as the imports map. Exports is the same as the paths map for jsconfig.json, except that the exports, the syntax is the same, but the paths here is, it has the same function as the imports map. It just has the same syntax as the package.json exports. And then a couple of other things now. I'm going to guess that we probably already covered this, whatever this is. Uber async. No, we didn't cover these. So you can call import as a function. This is also something that did not exist initially. Initially, it was just meant to be a top of file function. And the reason for that, like I said, Ruby guy comes from a synchronous background. I don't really know what he's doing. I've had words with him about it. But yeah, eventually people realized, we do want to be able to lazy load modules, that having a module be asynchronous doesn't actually give you any benefit of asynchrony. And the claim is, well, it allows JavaScript to run and the browser to render while it's fetching the modules, which is yeah, that's true. But none of your JavaScript's running because it's got to wait for all of the imports of every file to resolve before the very first function can run. So no, you're not actually getting the benefit of that. So they turned the import keyword into a function, and then as a function, you can await the import, and then it will go through that whole life cycle of fetching it, compiling it, getting it ready to run, and you can use it that way. So right now I don't really use this. If you're into the philosophy that Quick has of the lazy module loading, this might be something that you want to use. I'm certainly not opposed to it, but I do think in general, unless you have a really good reason to do otherwise, your imports and your requires should never be dynamic. They should always be statically analyzable. And you should just put your imports up at the top. And if you have something that's truly a separate module, a separate component that can be lazy loaded, then just make it a separate component. Just make it a different app. And one app requires these files, and one app requires these files. And if you've got a significant chunk of code, not just 2 or 3 lines, but 50 lines, 100 lines, something like that, where they need to share it, then just put that in a file that they both import, and then you get the best of all worlds.
2 use cases for the import function.
Great.
The first one is to write a module that's properly cross-platform. That'll work in both browser and Node, where maybe the only way to import something in Node is a way that the browser does not support, or vice versa. That happens occasionally. So you can conditionally either import with this function or require with the require function, based on whether you're in Node or not.
That doesn't work as far as I'm aware, because when it parses the import, if it parses the import keyword, it will disallow the require keyword.
It has worked for me, yeah.
Recently, in non-transpiled code?
Last year.
Okay, it'd be interesting to see,
Yeah.
but you shouldn't need that anymore, because as long as you're using the current LTS version of Node, you shouldn't need that anymore, because now require will work with imports and import will work with require correctly.
Yeah, with Node, you can use require. You can now require ESM. That's the change, right? So yeah, but I don't think it's the other way around. I don't think you can use the import syntax.
You can.
Like Node. Okay.
Yep,
All right.
you can.
Okay.
It gets used like lazy loading components gets used in apps like React and stuff based off of which route you're on, so you don't have to like load the whole. You call them apps, yeah. Just kind of route splitting.
Yeah.
There are cases where there are various libraries where the file that you would import for the browser doesn't actually export anything. It only attaches to the global object, which breaks if it happens in Node. There are still plenty of libraries where you kind of have to import one way or the other depending on what environment you're in. If library is well written, then you're not going to run into that, but plenty of libraries still work like that.
Yeah, fork it and just fix the line at the top and the bottom and don't deal with it ever again. Well, obviously that's not always the right solution, but...
Other use case I have for this is that you can import things dynamically, because it is a real string that you can construct yourself.
Yes.
So,
This does not follow the same constraint as when you do an import up the top.
So I've had code that dynamically imports from like either the development folder or the distribution folder, depending on how the script was run. And this is basically the only way to do that.
So I agree with you. I have done that as well. Where possible, I recommend that you just have a generator command. So I usually have a scripts folder, and I'll do like /script/generate_x to generate that, so that you get static analysis on it. Because if you import it dynamically, I mean, I don't know how it's working in your case, but generally speaking, your tools won't be able to statically analyze it properly, because most of them are not. I don't know of any in JavaScript that are advanced enough that they can do determine what you're reading from. Like Zig can do that, but and hopefully one day JavaScript will be able to, or some tool in JavaScript will be able to. But if you just write, a little generator and it reads the folder and then spits out the file names, then you can have static analysis and not lose any of your linting or your type checking. Obviously, there's a trade-off there, because you have to write a little generator script. But from my perspective, having access to the tooling is worth more than having the convenience of looping over a directory or concatenating dev versus prod string. I've definitely done it. I'm just saying that in most cases, unless it's a quick little ditty, I don't prefer to do it that way, because the tooling doesn't work as well.
You will generally need to be prepared to attach a type definition to whatever you're importing, so the TypeScript knows what you're doing.
Yeah.
Here's an example of like so V is a transpiled step, but you can like.
Let me see. Yeah, you gotta like control plus that like 10 times, because compared to most people, I'm blind.
So this is based off of transpiling through V. There's import.meta.glob, and then you can it will look in that path and expand out all of the static import things that you can lazily load in later.
Interesting. But this is transpiled, is it not? Because that's doing.
It is transpiled.
Okay, yeah.
You would have to use something like Beat.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Okay, yeah. All right. Yeah, and so, and again, like the purpose, for me, the purpose of the presentation is to talk about real ESM.
Yeah.
Because when you transpile, you can make up whatever you want. Now, with that having just been said, there are certain particular things about Node that are different from the browser and that are implementation specific. And one of them is getting the current directory name. And so I just wanted to show how you do that. It's very simple, but you don't, when you opt into JavaScript modules, you opt out of a number of features that would otherwise be available in Node. And I don't exactly know why that is, because I can't think of any reason that Node wouldn't be able to inject a global variable into a ESM module just as easily as it can inject a global variable into a non-ESM module. But for whatever reason, they don't include dir name when it is in module mode. And in order to get that, it is import.meta.url, and that is something that exists in the browser too, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it is. I hope I'm not lying about that. I believe that import.meta is part of it. Now I feel so unsure about this. I don't think I've had much reason to use it in the browser, but in Node I've had to do this. So when you're in Node, the URL is going to begin with a file prefix, so you can just slice off the file prefix and then call path.dirname, and then you're good to go.
Just making an attempt at a straight up import meta inside of console. It's like the syntax has to be within a module. But yeah, you're probably right that it exists in the browser.
Now I feel so self-conscious because I didn't actually try it in the browser. Anyway, so I hope that was useful. Thanks for coming to my presentation.
Yeah, I learned quite a few things here and there in that.
Part that was most new to me was the very last part. I guess I'll try that right now.
So any other questions or comments?
It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks once you've gotten like so familiar with just using like bundlers like Beat and stuff like that. It's hard to step away from them. Bun has some nice. I want to get to the point where I can just use Bun for the full stack of stuff.
Yeah, I should try it again. Every single time I've tried Bun, I have immediately hit into something unsupported, and it's because I do a lot of weird stuff.
I saw your comment that you're disappointed that they're introducing the MySQL syntax on top of the SQL interpreter or whatever.
Yeah, SQL is just, it's kind of it's deceptive because it has the appearance of being similar. It's like the difference between, I don't know, I don't
And JavaScript.
I don't know, because the if you just look at it with your eyeballs, things look so similar. It's okay. It's like the opposite of tomato, potato, and eggplant, right? Tomato, potato, and eggplant are all part of the same family, but they look very different. But then there's other things, potato and sweet potato. Nothing alike. Completely different families, unrelated plant species. But you could be forgiven for thinking that they're the same, right? And so that's what I think the sequels are like. The sequels are so incredibly different in fundamental and important ways that the idea of trying to write tools that work with two different SQL languages just doesn't make any sense. You need a tool that works for one SQL language, you need a tool that works for the other SQL language, and if you happen to be able to copy and paste some code from your parser, then great. But trying to create parsers and tools that can understand multiple SQL languages, it would be as silly as trying to create a tool that can parse both Java and JavaScript. It's deceptive because the things that hardly matter at all, like the words select, from, and where, are the same. But then the escapes, the quotes, the listing tables, getting row information, the data that how the data comes back, like nothing else is the same. It's like there's 6 words in the language that are the same words, but again, it's just like, oh well, Java has a for and JavaScript has a for. I should just parse them with the same parser, and that's not what it is. Or if you say, well, Rust has let and for, and JavaScript has let and for, I'll just use the same parser. So that's where I don't like it, because what they're doing is they're committing to mediocrity. They're committing, and unless they've got just tons of VC funding, which maybe they do, and I don't know why they would, and that scares me, because that means that, for all the struggles that Node has, not having had consistent and integrated VC fund, like the biggest problem Node had was once it got VC funding, and VC funding just ruins things because it's misaligned incentives. But anyway, unless they just have tons of VC funding, they're not going to have enough people to actually make the SQL syntaxes good. So I would rather say, okay, make Postgres perfect and don't add anything else. Or make SQLite perfect and don't add anything else. But once you have it perfect, and you can get it perfect, because there's a finite number of keywords and there's a finite number of clauses and all that. But if you make it perfect, then move on to something else. But don't half-bake SQLite, then half-bake Postgres, then add MySQL into the mix, because all you're going to get is a bunch of crap that doesn't work well.
Be bloated and bundled inside of the big binary instead of separate modules that you import.
Well, that I don't know about, from the being big and bloated, because when you look at, like, if I was going to do it with the experience that I have today, what I would do is I would create 3 separate projects, one for SQLite, one for Postgres, and actually if I were going to do it, I'd just leave MariaDB out of it, because it's bloat without distinction, as Rob Pike would say. But anyway, so take those two. I think that SQLite and Postgres are both incredibly valuable in their own right, and they provide enough uniqueness that it's good. But I would not create the same parser for them. I'd create a SQLite parser or whatever, SQLite binding, SQLite tooling, and I'd create Postgres tooling, and we would just copy and paste some functions. Like maybe we'd copy and paste a lot of functions. Maybe we'd copy and paste 60% of the functions. Maybe 70% of the functions. But I don't think we would, because there's all those little tiny things that are different. But even if we had to copy a lot of functions, I'd just have 2 separate ones. But once you compile that all down, you're looking at Zig. Once you compile that down, you could be looking at, just bytes. Well, it'd probably be kilobytes, but it doesn't have to be huge. There's not a lot of syntax there. I mean, there is, but there isn't. I think that you would get worse code bloat if you tried to make one module that handled both of them than having 2 separate modules that handle each of them. Especially because an optimizer would hopefully, I don't know how maybe it wouldn't be, but I would hope that the optimizer would just detect the duplicate, like the verbatim functions, and just optimize them away.
I like I haven't toyed with it yet, but I like that they're doing like bundler stuff, like the Vite layer thing, because that was the piece to me that still blending in Vite on top of it. But this 1.2 update, I need to toy with, tinker with.
Yeah, I want to try it again. I also want to. There's a service I want to use Dino for. Well, maybe, I don't know. Dino, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about Dino.
You know. me neither. Every time I try to step into it.
But I actually believe that he's correct that the Bun people are lying about their performance, that they're cherry picking, they're cherry picking things that look really good, but that don't actually tell the real story. But still, between Node and Bun, I imagine that Bun is actually significantly faster. And then Dino, they say that they're optimized for performance for real applications, not just toy benchmarks, but that their real application performance is much better. But I guess the problem I have with it is, if you cared about performance that much, why would you use JavaScript? I mean, if V8 is not good enough for you with Node, are you really gonna cut the cloth on Dino or Bun? I think the convenience of Bun is what it started out to do, which is just be faster at the tooling crap. And then now Node's trying to catch up with that, and Node's trying to integrate that stuff. So, you know, it may end up that Node just gets whatever Bun has. And yeah, maybe it'll be 10% slower, but you know, will you really care? I think that Bun's exciting. I don't think that Dino's very exciting, but I don't know. The reason that I wanted to use Dino was potentially just because there's a browser module, I forget what it's called, but you can take screenshots of a browser, and there's actually a new thing called Use Terminal. Let me see if I can bring that up. I think this is what they're doing. I don't know that it's what they're doing, but I think it's what they're doing. So it's Terminal e-ink dashboard. So this thing right here. I believe that what they are doing is that they are sending a web page to a server. The web page has certain widgets on it. Then they are screenshotting the web page with a headless browser. Then they're converting it to grayscale. Then they're converting it to monochrome pixels. Yeah. So I believe that this comes because it looks so sophisticated, but the device that's in here is very unsophisticated. It's an ESP32, which is like a Pico Pi or a STM32 or whatever.
But it's touchscreen, so you can like navigate around. Nope. This is it's an incredibly simple thing. I've pre-ordered one. I should get my batch in March, and I'm looking forward to it. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. I don't I ordered it intuitively. I looked at it and I thought there is something here. I don't know what it is, because obviously like what they're advertising it for, I think is like the stupidest stuff you could ever advertise something for. Nobody needs this, right? Like this does not improve anyone's life. This is not like I have a hard time believing what they're selling on the homepage. I've got my fingers crossed that they are seeing, you know, something in the future where it's like, okay, we got a small group of hobbyists that want a little e-ink screen because it's cool. But once we produce an e-ink screen and we've got the battery power and the savings and the Wi-Fi setup and the app, well, okay, now we can do a thermostat. You know, okay, now that we've got a thermostat, you know what else we're going to do? We're going to do a camera. Like, to me, this is like the gateway drug to real home automation, because they're starting with a very simple platform that they could replicate to other devices and add simple peripherals where it'll be a little bit of code added as they grow. I don't know if that's what their plan is. But when I look at this, that's kind of, you know, that's what I'm thinking. I'm like, man, I wish I had a company that was selling these. Should you have to pay for the Kickstarter?
The thing I think was $140. It's a 7-inch screen, and the key thing here is it's got a battery, it's got the screen, it's got the little ESP32 and the plastic mold. I mean, I'm a little bit afraid that they're actually going the opposite direction. because where they're making their money, I don't think they're actually making money off the hardware. I think that they're making money off the subscription service, because what they want to do is they want to sell these widgets. And if that's really their business model, I can't see it going very far, but maybe it will. I mean, there's tons of things that take off, and I'm like, I can't fathom how that took off. But yeah, a lot of these hobbyist creators are reviewing it on YouTube and stuff. But yeah, I could see the core technology being extrapolated. And everything on here is all about the device, but when you actually get a little further into it, it's like, oh, well, sign into your dashboard and get into the widgets and blah, 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 blah.
But you'd be controlling it from like your phone or something to like swap screens.
No, you use their server. So you define the widgets that you want. So you create a few panels, and then you say, okay, well, and you say, I want it to switch between panels every 10 minutes. And so for 10 minutes, it's showing you your GitHub stats, and then it switches over to showing you your calendar, and then it switches over to showing you. And so it's divided into quadrants, and it can display the widgets at different sizes, and then it can show, let's see if they, so like here's the calendar widget. Let's see if they're going to do anything else here. Stocks. I mean, it's very much like the widgets you have on your phone. It's the weather, the sports game, calendar. So they have all these different plugins that are in the online widgets, and you sign in online, and then you get connected to the widget, and then you pay some fee in order to buy the widgets themselves, as well as to have access to the online service, period. So that, I mean, it looks like there's 10 times as much work has gone into the widgets and the widget portal than has gone into the device. The device is literally, you can buy almost exactly the same thing on AliExpress, except that it's missing a piece of software that has a few lines of code to go fetch a URL with a API token. Exactly. So the software on the device is completely unsophisticated. It's just writing a monochrome bitmap to a screen and doing a fetch that has a timer on it and a token. The most complex part of this, as far as the hardware goes, would be getting the Wi-Fi hotspot set up with the phone so that you can put in your actual Wi-Fi credentials and then have it connect, right? So.
Sweet.
But yeah. Anyway, I will stop streaming because we're not even talking JavaScript no more.
No more.
No more.